Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Annie Philbin. I'm the director of the Hammer Museum, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here today. As most of you are aware, this coming Tuesday marks the 97th anniversary of the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. And in commemoration of this dark chapter of history, we're very proud to present a dialogue between two astoundingly brilliant, multifaceted artists, filmmaker Arto Tuncboyacıyan and bona fide rock star Serj Tankian. Both of these artists are of Armenian descent, and they will be discussing the impact of the Armenian Genocide on their own lives and on their work. I'd especially like to thank my good friend, Eric Israelian, a member of the Hammer's Board of Directors and the Vice Chief of the Division of Digestive Diseases at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He has been very generous with his time in helping to organize these events that we've presented in the last week or so, and I'm very delighted to invite him up to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Annie. Welcome. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Hammer Conversation today, and I specifically want to thank Anne Philbin, Director of the Hammer Museum, Jennifer Wells-Green, and Claudia Bester. And Claudia Bester is the Director of Public Programs, and she has done an amazing job putting this entire week together. And I also want to thank the entire Hammer Museum staff because they have worked tirelessly for not only this week, but all of the public programs. It's a great pleasure of mine to be part of this specific Hammer Conversation. It's one of the signature series of the museum, but this conversation is a kind of a culmination of a week of Armenian Genocide remembrance, which is important not only to me, but also to our many of our guests here today and to our friends who are going to be participating in the conversation, Arto Tuncboyacıyan and Serj Tankian. Earlier this week, we screened Ararat on Monday, and that was followed by a question and answer session by David Alpay. And on Tuesday, we screened Screamers, which was followed by a question and answer session by the filmmaker Carla Garabedian. And today we have the great pleasure of having this conversation between Serj and Arto, and I'll get to their introduction in one moment. Many of you might wonder, so why is this doctor from UCLA here and talking about the Armenian Genocide and introducing these great artists? Well, if you haven't figured it out by now, I'm also Armenian. And for many of us in the diaspora, our culture and the ripple effect of the genocide influences who we are today, the choices we make, and the attitudes and beliefs we have about oppressed people, about people who are the underserved and disadvantaged. And for those of you who are not aware, in the early part of the 20th century, approximately 1.5 million Armenians were killed as part of a systematic program of genocide in the Ottoman Empire. And for many of us in the diaspora, again, this ripple effect permeates to this very day. And unfortunately, that genocide that took place set the tone for many of the other horrors of the 20th century. And oftentimes, under the guise of trying to suppress rebellion, people can be slaughtered, and it's very difficult for them to stand up for their rights. And we see that occurring even to this very day in parts of the world. So today we're going to hear from two amazing artists, and they're going to speak about, not only about genocide, but about how their culture influences their art, which I think is one of the most fascinating parts of this kind of lecture, this kind of conversation, and really influences also who they are and the choices they make both artistically and professionally. So let me tell you a little bit about these two amazing artists because it's a real treat for them to be here today, and I'm proud to call them friends. Arto Tuncboyacıyan is an award-winning, brilliant filmmaker who has been nominated for 2 Academy Awards and has won a lot of acclaim for his writing, directing, and producing of films such as Felicia's Journey, The Sweet Hereafter, and of course Ararat, which is the film we screened on Monday. And Ararat is specifically an important film I wanted to highlight because it's the 10th anniversary of the film screening at the Cannes Film Festival. And it brought the story of the Armenian Genocide to a modern-day audience for really in an uncomparable fashion. And he was able to weave in this powerful story of genocide into modern-day Canada in 2002 and really touch themes of family, art, heritage, and of course the genocide. And I think he's one of the most highly regarded filmmakers from the standpoint of not only his ability to weave in stories, but characters and how powerful all these interconnected components of our lives are, whether you're Armenian, not Armenian. I mean, he's really just a brilliant filmmaker. His friend, who's also here today, is another amazing artist in his own right, and that's Serj Tankian. Serj is probably most well known for his founding the amazing heavy metal and rock band System of a Down. And he is also a highly regarded writer, screenwriter, in terms of one of the things he was telling me about. Filmmaker is another aspiration of his, musician, poet, and real activist for human rights throughout the world. And that's one of the things that's most impressive about Serj is his ability to use a platform and the achievements he's reached in terms of conveying this to the rest of the world in a manner that opens eyes for people who might otherwise not be aware of our history. The other thing that's most poignant about Serj, I think, for me, is his role in the film Screamers, which we screened on Tuesday. And the story of his grandfather, who was a genocide survivor, and the vivid images that his grandfather recalled, I think were probably the most compelling parts of the film, and is something that I'll never forget. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our two guests, Arto Tuncboyacıyan and Serj Tankian.
We just spent a really great day together, so we're a little blissed out. But our worlds kind of connected in 2001 when I was preparing Ararat, and right. Your album came out, Toxicity, and there was this cut called Pluck, Politically Lying Unholy Cowardly Killers.
Right.
And I listened to it and I thought, oh, how can I fit this into the movie somehow? And there was this one scene which I was actually thinking of cutting out of the film, which was Rafi and Celia making out in her home grow kind of like right. Loft. And I thought, okay, no, that'd be great. They'd be listening to that song while they're making love, which is kind of an odd choice. Anyway, but I remember going through the management, and I got a response so quickly from you, saying, yeah, whatever, you know, like the song is theirs for free. Yeah, and I thought that was like so amazing that you guys did that, and it was so generous. And then we connected. I guess the next time System was coming through Toronto, and it was just really incredible. So, yeah, and I think it's interesting when we look at, you know, that we have very different formations. I mean, Serj was born in Beirut and came to the country when he was young, 7, right? Mm-hmm. And was really involved with the Armenian community here. Was raised within the community, and went to AYF and mm-hmm. very engaged. And I was born in Cairo, but when my family moved to Canada, we moved to the furthest city on the west coast, Victoria, British Columbia, and we were like the only Armenian family there. So I was not raised within the community at all. And as a matter of fact, I would say that the primary thrust was to assimilate. So we come from really different places. And I think it's interesting that at a certain point, for me, was when I went to university at 18, and there was an Armenian Student Association. And it was a very, very engaged period. It was in the late 70s, early 80s. And there was so much activity, extreme activity happening. And as an Armenian, I was overwhelmed by all of this, and I needed to understand why this was all happening. And I committed myself, to really to learn and to get involved. At a relatively late age, like 18, 19, is when I started. You you were involved from the
I was
beginning.
involved from, probably about 16, 17 as well.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
I went to Armenian school. I went to Pilibos in Hollywood and grew up, locally. But as far as, so I was given the background and had the, didn't have the isolation from the community as you had earlier on. But at the same time, I didn't really get into as much of, activism and Armenian activism until I was probably about 16.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was curious because it was immediate activism. Like, basically, this is 1980, 1981, and so there was, this extreme activity happening. And so as students, we were really engaged in all of that. And so it was a crazy way to get into it, really. And also the extent of the denial was not something I really understood. It seemed that was something that was probably ingrained in you, right? That this was like a really huge struggle. And for me, it was just the nature of... I remember my parents went to Armenia when I was like when I was like 14, and my father came back and he was completely changed. He went to Tsidzananabert and he just had a complete kind of collapse and kind of a meltdown, actually. And he came back and he still can't talk about this kind of vision that he had when he was in this monument and without crying. Like, he's just and I think it was years of kind of not talking about it. And,
right.
His mother was an orphan, my grandmother, and my father went back and met my grandmother in an orphanage. And she was like, no one really knew exactly where she was from. I knew that my grandfather was from Arabkir, and my father just didn't really dwell on it when I was being raised, and then when he came back, I just saw how traumatic this was for him. So
what's interesting about that is, as far as assimilation, as Armenians that have lived under Ottoman rule for 600 years. Assimilation was a life-saving, tool. You were always the minority, so kind of blending in and not, at the same time putting the pain behind is such a natural reaction for a victim of any, tragedy.
Yeah. Though that being said, we put it behind for a long time, and that was also. I think a lot of people don't understand how that happened. It was really around the 50th anniversary that it began to kind of creep into people's consciousness again. I think around 1965 there was, but until that time, you're right. I mean, it was a relatively quiet matter. And why do you think that is? I've never really understood. Like, yes, it's natural to assimilate, but it seemed that the Armenian issue and the whole idea of claiming it, was not something that was picked up, that soon. And I think that when I talk to, let's say, other people, that's always a question that they have.
Yeah, that is curious, isn't it? I think it takes time to set up. The only thing I can think of is it takes time to set up diasporan communities. All of the kind of primary things that are necessary in terms of taking care of the population once they were outside of that, the Armenian space, historical lands, and setting up schools, setting up all the churches, and I'm sure. So it was a matter of time. But yeah, you would think that there would be immediately a lot more kind of voices rising up, and as World War II, happened in the 40s, and our genocide was during World War I. So
and Lemkin, of course, Raphael Lemkin, when he was actually coining the term genocide, was using the Armenian genocide as a prototype. There's
right.
that interview I just saw where it's kind of amazing to see him actually refer to this event. And yet, when you think about our artists and writers, and it wasn't something that was being dealt with immediately. Of course, maybe part of that was because on April 24th, the first people to be rounded up were the intellectuals and the artists,
right.
and we lost so many people, in that first round, right? And so maybe, we were really cut off at the roots, and that we lost our sense of leadership, and it just, I often think that particular aspect of the genocide is something that we we forget. Because my family is from Vaspurakan and kind of like in yours probably, and we are all coming from this this particular area. We forget that Istanbul, which was relatively unblemished, except for that one event,
right?
Which in a matter of a week, just kind of wiped out most of the leaders.
Right.
I think that one thing I keep promoting to people, and I'm amazed how many Armenians have bought it but not read it, is Armenian Golgotha, which is the account of Peter Balakian's great uncle, and it's unbelievable. It's this eyewitness account, and from this person who has a photographic memory of what happened on April 24th. He was actually one of the people who was rounded up, and he was one of the people who was not executed and sent away on a train. He actually shared a train car with Gomidas, and he actually is recounting, like seeing his breakdown, on this car, and it's an amazing. It's like our Primo Levi in a way. So I would really encourage people to read that. But it's the aspect of our catastrophe that we forget that it was that calculated, that there was this decision to kind of cut off all the leaders in one place, and then leave that city relatively unperturbed, and then go after the...
well, it was also the capital where a lot of, foreign embassies were and whatnot, so the rest of the country was in turmoil.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the whole planning thing, when they talk about whether, obviously it was a very systematic kind of execution. But, just looking at the map, if you look at the map of the places where genocide were done, it was all over the country, all over the, basically the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, what's known as Turkey today. And, without some type of kind of executive order from the top, it would be impossible to kind of make all that happen at the same time.
Absolutely,
virtually impossible.
Well, the other thing that I refer to, because very often when you speak to Turkish denialists, they will say that any British accounts or French accounts or American accounts, Morgenthau and Usher, that was used in Ararat, that those were all part of the propaganda, because they were all part of the West. But the thing that there's no response to are these very, detailed eyewitness accounts coming from German consular heads who were stationed at the time in every one of these towns. And at the time, because they were allied with Turkey, they were horrified that they were going to be blamed somehow.
Sure.
And it's incredible when you read these accounts that there's no way that can be disputed.
Right.
I mean, those are not propaganda. Those are actually being sent to the Reich counselor, pleading for them to kind of, get an answer as to how this is happening. But they're also, and this is what's so ominous and dark about it, a lot of these consular heads who were horrified by what they saw, later on, of course, went back to Germany and became, involved as the Nazi Party was being formed. And a lot of those ideas that of what they saw, they understood that under the cover of war, you could actually get away with this. That deportations and movements were things that could somehow be justified. So there's recently Professor Dadrian has published a lot of new work dealing with the German archives. There's a site called Armenocide, I think, where you can actually comb through. For those of you who are more academically inclined, you could actually go through it in more detail as well. But it is this prototype, and it's what's horrifying, I think, is that I'm one of the people who do believe that this continues through this act of denial. That's something that is...
The act of denial is a very unique thing if you look at it. When Carla was about to start making Screamers, I remember having the conversation with her about the aspect of denial, because I thought it was such a modern story. I mean, the genocide was 97 years ago, but the denial is such a current story, and to have a country that's still denying part of their history is so unique for so long. And obviously it's, we're enabling it internationally. I don't mean we by the Armenian people, but the international community in terms of NATO and whatnot, based on their, political gain and, economic capital and whatnot. But it's such a unique story. I mean, here we are in a country that every year we're trying to fight for denial. You're from Canada, who have already, blatantly accepted the Armenian Genocide. How does that feel?
Well, it feels pretty amazing, but it also happened in this crazy way, right? Where we had an election in 2003, which was a year, we had a screening of Ararat in Ottawa, which is our national capital, and a lot of politicians came because the film won for Best Film in Canada that year and went to Cannes and had all this. So it was a really well-attended screening. And at that time, the Liberal Party, which is kind of the equivalent of the Democrats, I guess, if you're going to make a rough kind of comparison, they'd been in power for 20 years. And they were always very pro-genocide, I mean, or Armenian kind of issue, but they never went that far. You know, there was always a reason. There was the usual reason that you hear. And what was fascinating is that the Conservative Party, which I guess is kind of, I would say, like the Republicans, again, not a direct match, but they were a relatively fringe party. And no one expected them to sweep the election in 2003. And part of their platform was that that they would recognize the Armenian Genocide. Now, you've heard it all before. I mean, you know, when the presidential, you know, candidates say they're going to recognize, they're going to make it there. And then once they get into power, they're aware of the history of what they're dealing with and, you know, from all different sort of pressures, and they bend. And they start come up with all sorts of excuses, which is what you're dealing now with Obama, of course. But what happened in Canada was really interesting, which is that the Conservative Party, that was a relatively small party, got into power unexpectedly. And one of the first questions that came up, obviously from the Armenian lobby in Ottawa, was, so what's your stand on the Armenian Genocide? And the leader actually said, well, we said what our stand was during the election, and we're going to stick by it. And with that simple statement, that was it. Canada officially recognized the Armenian Genocide. And I think what it was is that because no one was expecting that they were going to.
So there wasn't like a parliamentary resolution.
It passed,
but that was
like
after?
You know, basically it happened so fast, and I don't even think that the Turkish sort of like, you know, lobby had time to kind of like understand how quickly it was happening, and it just happened.
Wow.
And what it means, of course, is that it puts us into a place that I think most Armenians should be at, which is that we shouldn't be waiting for other people to, because once it happens, you kind of go, okay, so next, I mean, what's the issue? And the feeling is really that we don't have anything to prove. I mean, we know it happened.
Right.
The real issue is, why do you need to deny it so much? You know, why is it that that's your problem? That's not our problem. Our problem is that, you know, we understand that this happened. This was a calamity that befell our people. But what we were curious about is your problem in not being able to address this.
Well, ultimately, it's about justice, isn't it? You know, it's not about the denial or the acceptance. You know, I always give the example, if someone came to my house and robbed it and killed my family, and I was going after them for 100 years, you know, and if they turned around and go, I did it, I'm sorry. What is that?
Yeah.
You know, like, you know, what does that mean? You know, it's recognition obviously is an important first step as a base, but it's really about justice.
Right, and that becomes this. We were talking about this last night. I mean, that's a whole other issue, which is probably outside of, you know, this conversation, which is how does that actually present itself? But I think just psychologically, I think very often, I mean, I just refuse to get caught up in this argument anymore. Like when because there's some very clever people that are in very high positions who often are brought to events like this, and when there is a question period, they'll be the first to actually ask the question. And I just don't engage with those people anymore. It's just sort of like next, you know, because it's just it's one of those things where I feel that to become you know, engaged in the conversation puts you in a position where you have to respond in a rational way. And there's something so deeply irrational about the extent of the denial, given, you know, the facts that we were talking about, that it just, you know, it's not our problem.
It's actually, there's a certain rationality to it that I see, I think, and it comes from the early, you know, right after World War I, when the Kemalist government took over, and there was the military tribunal when the generals were, you know, basically, you know, they were committed in absentia to death, right? They were, you know, that was the verdict that they passed. But I think as soon as the Kemalist government realized that it's not just about, you know, putting these guys in jail or executing them, that there's actually an issue of land or recompensation, then the story changed. That's when the denial actually started from that day. And today, I think, you know, as far as like what a lot of historians, I think, feel is that the denial continues because of that reason. You know, they don't want to pay. Basically, they don't want to pay their bill.
Right. But I also think you raised a really interesting point, which is that let's make no mistake about the fact that this denial was only possible because of the West. The West actually aided and abetted in this denial. Basically what happened, I think, is that Ataturk said, hey, if you want access to the Mosul oil fields, if you want, we have to remember that after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, this was riches that the West had not seen since the discovery of gold in South America.
The whole Middle East.
It was like a huge, amount of wealth, which Ataturk basically said, I'll give you access to on the condition that we let these issues drop.
Right.
And the West was only too eager, and in this country, as you all know, with the extraordinary efforts of Woodrow Wilson, going to Paris, it's very interesting to me that as the European powers were carving up, the Middle East for their own economic sort of gain, America went and only looked for one mandate, and we know where that was. It was Armenia. And basically, Woodrow Wilson came back to Congress and said, we have a mandate for Armenia. And Congress went, you mean you went to Paris and everyone else was carving up, this place for wealth, and you've come back with a place that has no resources at all, and it was just shot down. So that's how...
As were his League of Nations.
As League of Nations to the Treaty of Sèvres, all these sort of things which were basically shut down by the West's greed for oil. And it's shocking, how there's this sort of hypocrisy, I think, in terms of it being a Turkish denial. But in fact, there was this a number of decades where it became institutionalized by the West's complete acceptance of this as being a non-issue.
Right. Well, what's also interesting is in those early days, besides the oil rights, there also was not like a real international framework for something like genocide. You're looking at the first genocide of history.
Right.
There's no international reference. How do we try these people? Where do we take them? Does Malta work? And the whole idea of the Malta trials didn't work out and whatnot. And at the same time, the Kemalist government had kind of started with kind of getting people into the streets and rioting, and here are the British forces in Istanbul, and there's all this rioting going on, breaking people out of prison, and they're like, oh my God, how do we deal with this, So it's quite interesting, like looking at the Nuremberg trials after World War II, there was no such trial after World War I.
Right.
And because of that, the Armenian Genocide was technically never entered into the books as a crime against humanity, which allowed Turkey to kind of continue its denialist campaign and say, oh, there was never a trial. But obviously there are reasons why there was not a trial. It was, the first international genocide, and the Allied powers didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
Plus there was the whole greed, oil aspect. And
in fact,
not to cut you off, but League of Nations didn't work out, and then the United Nations became what League of Nations was supposed to be after World War II. So basically, after World War II, the Allied powers realized what they had not done during World War I after the war,
right.
Which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's and here we are like now almost 100 years later, still trying to understand what the mechanics were that allowed this to happen, and still trying to rationalize what is it that we're seeking in terms of justice, right? Like how do we approach that subject? And
I think envisioning that is really important.
I think it's hugely important because I think if a time does come when Turkey does accept, we have to be ready to understand what it is that we're asking for.
I think we should ask. We are already asking for things regardless of the acceptance. Whether it's the insurance kind of collective civil lawsuits against insurance companies that insured victims of the Armenian Genocide at the time, or the Incirlik Air Base lawsuit, or there's so many ways of attempting justice, I think, and I think we're finally moving on than just waiting for Turkey to give us a hey, we've accepted it. It's like
and all I'm asking for is for a TV series, and you're asking for an album.
Seriously. But envisioning that justice is very important. It's like, when John Lennon was, war is over, about Vietnam. It's like, let's envision the war being done with already, because that already takes you already into a new process, into a new perspective, way of thinking.
Yeah.
And I think that's important here. Yeah.
But going back to your question about how does it feel as a Canadian, I mean, I'm still shocked at how much the issue does come up, right? It's not as though once it's officially recognized that it's over, because there's still this incredible lobby that's trying to open up kind of debates and kind of like discussion groups, and it's still this strange issue that's kind of courted, and every time you see. On the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, there's still, like you kind of go, why are you using the word alleged? I mean, or why are you talking about like competing claims, or on the other side, like there is no other side, right?
Right.
But it's something that you still have to remain, I guess, vigilant towards, but it's
absolutely,
it's a very odd situation to be in. I don't think I've ever met anyone else who's suffered sort of a national trauma that's in quite the same psychic space that we have been in. It's interesting because I think you could make an argument that the massacres in Nanjing were also denied by the Japanese for a very long time. But that seems to there's an openness now, or it's beginning to open. Or certainly the Japanese are opening up to what happened in Korea, and I don't know if anything else has had quite that degree of ambiguity around it, though. Interestingly enough, you could say that we are still a bit fuzzy about what's happening in Darfur, right? What do we do with genocide?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, 20th century is marred by genocide, the Holocaust, the Armenian Genocide, Pol Pot, like Stalin of his own people, and all this stuff, like tens, if not 100 million people dying at the hands of man in ethnic cleansing, and yet we have no international framework by the UN or any other international organization for genocide. We have the ICC, we have the World Court, but they don't even try cases that are retrospective.
Right.
And they don't try cases without a nation bringing up the claim. It's really interesting. We were talking about this yesterday. There was no international framework for genocide when the Armenian Genocide occurred. And now, even after the Holocaust and after all these genocides have occurred, there is no international response to genocide. If it's happening today, there's nothing in the United Nations or no general agreement that goes, whoever's allies with this nation, whether it's China or the US or whoever it is, they have to stop supporting this nation because this is genocide. This is the red code. Every other bet is off the table. There is nothing that prioritizes genocide over regular international trade until today. And when President Bush said it was genocide in Darfur, what happened? What did he do? Nothing. Like in the film Screamers that Carla really, greatly presented. And that's even more dangerous than not calling it genocide.
Right.
If you're unable to act in a multilateral fashion to stop a genocide or help the victims, calling it genocide is even worse.
Yeah, which raises the question of going back almost 100 years. What would have happened if the West did understand that what was happening was genocide? What could we, with all the foreign missionaries and all of the, the German consular heads or whatever it was? I mean, it was a state of war. How could we have imagined anything being other than what it was in terms of once that plan is executed and it happens, it's horrifying to think that now almost 100 years later we still can't stop it. It's the darkest, most the most atrocious thing that we can imagine is racial genocide, and yet we don't have the mechanism to actually put that to a stop. Unless there's an economic interest that's identified, unless there's something where people can rally around an idea of their own standard of life being threatened. We can't reach out to other human beings as a race and understand that this is a common responsibility we have. How have we evolved to this point where we're still talking about how actions would be instituted?
I think an international framework to combat genocide on some component has to do with the deniers or the people that paying a price. I mean, today the French government is paying a price because of the bill that they passed, making it illegal for someone to deny genocide in France, the Armenian Genocide in France. The Constitutional Court overturned it as a freedom of speech issue, which is hypocritical because the Holocaust, speaking against the Holocaust is still a crime. And the Constitutional Court has not overturned that, which makes zero sense to me, obviously. So I think Turkey has got to pay a price for economic price because that's exactly the pressure they're exerting on other nations. With the U.S., their military and their kind of advisory role in the Middle East and whatnot is what they're dangling as far as a foreign policy carrot, and then canceling contracts, military contracts, defense contracts, and all sorts of trade with France and other nations. They're using economical weapons against nations that are doing the right thing or starting to do the right thing. So we have to figure out how we can reverse that.
Yeah. So let's go back then to what we do. I mean, you obviously have been extraordinary at using the platform that you have to talk about these issues publicly. But let's say in terms of the art itself, in terms of the let's say a song like Pluck, or
right.
I mean, do you feel that you can communicate the intricacies of or impart to people a history through a song like that? Is it something that, like I've been to, like these amazing concerts that the system has had, and I've seen, like people who are not Armenian, like talking about it, like it's part of the makeup of the band, right?
Yeah.
And so everyone knows where you're from. Do you think that when you create a song like that and you perform a song like that, that is able to communicate and transpose some of your own history directly to a listener? Like, is it something that is, what is the feeling that you get when you perform that song publicly?
Wow. Pluck's a pretty heavy song, and it's difficult to play.
Yeah.
But it's very powerful, and it's full of anger, and it's full of the desire to see justice on a really powerful scale. I think when it comes to songs and kind of that transference of the knowledge or the message that you're trying to portray, I think it's important that it's not preachy. I think it's important that you're not really trying. I think it's the same with all the arts. When you made Ararat,
that was the biggest challenge. Yeah.
I mean, no one wants to listen to a speech. So we're doing a conversation instead. So you don't want to be preachy. You want those to be your base raw emotions through the music or through your film coming out, and people kind of really feeling it for themselves, interpreting it for themselves. And maybe they don't interpret what you're saying. Maybe they interpret it in a different way, especially if you're not closely referencing what your kind of, what your message is. But nonetheless, I think that power of emotion comes through.
Well, it's a challenge, though, I think, when you're dealing with the narrative feature, though, because, I mean, the only way, because people don't know where to locate it, like specifically about the Armenian Genocide, it's just, people don't even know where Armenia is, and so the details of it, I mean, the only way I kind of got around it, and it's still, to me, the most kind of preposterous aspect of the movie is, this idea of a kid who's explaining the story to this stranger, Christopher Plummer,
right.
David Alpe, who's here, right? David, are you here? Oh, there you are. Sorry. Hi, welcome back. But that character of Rafi, who suddenly is with this person who happens to be, retiring the next day, unbeknownst to him, and has all the time in the world to hear this kid's story. Yeah. And so that becomes a way of him also telling the person who's watching the film who's never heard of it, who's in Christopher Plummer's sort of head, to get all of this detail, should they choose to, right? But short of that, it's really tricky because people don't know. And you don't want to go to the maps, at the beginning of a film, with the burning map and kind of like, the camera zooming in onto this part of the world, and it just seems to me it's challenging. Yep. And so what's exciting is that because the band itself identified so much as coming from this place, and because people listen to that song and they feel that anger, that then they go and do the research themselves, right? If they so choose. Like there is that, connection, and they become more active in seeking out that history.
Well, it's also your personal story, I mean, with us, when people refer to, System or myself being political in some of the stuff that we do, I get it, I understand, but when it comes to the Armenian Genocide issue, for me, it's not even political, it's personal. It's my history, it's my grandfather, grandmother's stories, And so it's more of a personal, so when you write a song from a personal basis, I think it's more effective, you know, than again being, you know, kind of thinking of more philosophical, political, you know, which could tend to be more preachy.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I don't know if you know the story, but I don't even know if I would have made this film if it wasn't for this really bizarre situation. I was shooting Felicia's Journey, and this producer, Robert Lantosh, who I'd worked with before, who was the head of a large entertainment company in Canada called Alliance. He was the founder of Alliance Communications. And the Armenian community was honoring me. This was in the late 90s. And they asked, you know, whether or not there was someone who could introduce me that I'd work with. And I said, well, Robert would be great because he's a huge supporter of my work. So Robert came to the Armenian Community Centre in Toronto and went up to the podium. And he looked out at the audience and just stared at the audience for a while and said, you know, as a Hungarian Jew, I've been raised with so many films about the Holocaust of my people, and he listed all these films that really influenced me. He said, I've never seen a film about the Armenian Genocide, and if Adam is ready to make that film, I'm ready to support it. And suddenly the audience just rose up and started cheering, you know, and, you know, just they were so excited. And I was sitting there going, oh, man, why did I invite you? Like, you know, like, why would you have done this? My career was just going. My career
sounds like a good opening act to me.
My career was going fine. You know, I didn't need to kind of like think about this at this point. But and so then right afterwards, you know, I sat down. I said, okay, were you serious about that? He goes, yeah. But he said, you know, the only trick is I've got like a 2-year window. It has to be made by that 2 years because I happen to have this financing in place right now for these projects that I want to do. And I was going like, I don't even have a script. I mean, like, you know, it has to be finished in 2 years, and so
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was pretty bizarre. So I thought about it, and well, what do you do? And I remembered in my early 20s, I had written this script based on Usher's book because I was doing a lot of my academic work. My degree's in international relations. I didn't study film, so I was doing a lot of writing about the Paris Peace Conference and about the competing views of Lenin and Woodrow Wilson around the question of national self-determination. And the Armenian question, of course, came in both of their agendas. But I came across this book by Clarence Usher, and I thought, wow, this is like an incredible story. The Siege of Van, it was like the Alamo, it was like, you know, Musa Dagh, you know, like it was just, I thought it was like an incredible story. And so I'd written this really early script, and I read it, I dug it out of a drawer, and I looked at it, and I was going, I can't make that movie. It just seems like so naive, and it's just, it's not what I'm feeling about this. Yeah. So I thought very quickly about making a film, about the making of that film, right, and how it would sort of impact these various characters living in Toronto in the present. And I remember I wrote this quite quickly, and I gave it to Robert, and he said, oh, that's probably not the movie that, you know, you should be making. You know, you should be making the movie within it, like do that film. And I was going, yeah, but I don't think anyone would be interested in that film, ultimately.
Well, part of it is that you were trying to tell a modern story through a historical reference.
Right.
You know, when it's just a historical story, it's a little more difficult to engage a modern audience. So maybe that's, you know.
Well, the thing that's interesting is that, you know, it was very controversial. I remember when we released it 10 years ago, and like a lot of people just know what to make of it. But it's amazing to me how it has continued. Like there's been so many papers written about it. I was in Tel Aviv like 2 years ago. There was a whole seminar like around the film, and there was a lot of academic work because I think certainly from a Jewish perspective, it's a fascinating sort of study in the transmission of trauma. And this idea of, well, what would have happened if the Holocaust had not been identified? Like, how would that have kind of reverberated through, right, you know? And it's almost this kind of test case, which is fascinating because when you look at the great novel, 40 Days of Musa Dagh, which written by an Austrian Jew, Franz Werfel, I mean, that he wrote that as a warning call to European Jewry at the time in the 30s. You know, he saw what had happened to the Armenians, and that after the formation of Israel, it was a book that everyone in that country read because it was like a textbook case, really. Before there was a Holocaust literature, there was 40 Days of Musa Dagh. So it's interesting how this idea of using the Armenian case as something which has a specific trajectory and looking at it from a modern perspective, it kind of has identified it, even though it was a pretty lonely period 10 years ago. Like it was really an odd thing to bring into the world when people wanted something, they wanted that film that was going to assert once and for all what had happened.
Right.
Right.
But I think it's really important. I mean, we were talking earlier about the economic kind of punishment that Turkey places on, allies that come up with the genocide resolution or recognition of the genocide, and we obviously don't have that strength. We don't have those economic means. But what we do have is the arts. There's some underlying kind of musical as well as all the other arts through our people, and that's something that I think we haven't recognized since the genocide. Friends that, like earlier on when we started doing music, the Armenian community was semi-supportive, but I think not as supportive as they would have been if they weren't ancestors of genocide victims. And to me, like if you talk to your Jewish friends, their mothers always want doctors and lawyers, right? And it's kind of the same with Armenians. Like we want professionals. And but just like Jews, we have a lot of artistic leanings, same as the Irish people, and it's kind of like one of our things. In the Ottoman Empire, all the major architects, all the major musicians were Armenian, for example. And so I think that's kind of interesting, coming back to the arts for us as a nation, as a strength, as a way of holding our heads up high. And
I think it is how stories are transmitted ultimately. I think that's one of the things I was trying to do in the film, is to show that there are these, the links are through, even our greatest artist, a genocide survivor, Arshil Gorky, even though he never really claimed that, right? He never claimed that experience. Right. And it was, in fact, something he was in denial of himself.
Absolutely.
But yet it's amazing to me how those objects, become a record of trauma, right? And how there's this idea of how objects and things that are made flow through our culture and are passed on, as long as we remain receptive to reading them. Right. As long as we understand that these things have a tremendous significance, and so I think that I totally agree with you that not only is it a question of giving value to our young artists, but also to the people who are studying the interpretation of the arts, right, and the people who are doing art history, and people who are curating, and people who are understanding how to place and contextualize this amazing heritage that we have, right? I mean, it's extraordinary to me that we are a stubborn culture, that we have been able to kind of resist, and you're right that how we do that very often is through our literature, through our artwork, through our plays, our music, our films. And it's probably the last thing that the Ottoman Turks would have ever imagined, in their worst nightmare, was that in this diaspora there would be artists like us sitting here, 100 years later talking about it. Like,
believe me, they hate you.
Yeah, well, they hate you too.
I know.
They hate both of us.
It's a compliment.
And on that sort of theme of like mutual hatred, are there any questions from denialists out there? Yes. Yes, there's a question up here.
For those of us who are totally ignorant of this until now, can you give us a really brief history of what motivated the Turks in their venal delirium to perpetrate this?
Do you want to? I'll start. I mean, okay, this is again, and you might disagree, but I do think that what happened, from my perspective, is that there was, starting in the late 19th century, there was some very unfair taxes that were being imposed on the Armenian communities. The Ottoman Empire was set up through a vilayet system, where basically minorities like the Greeks and the Jews and the Armenians had a degree of internal autonomy through their religious leaders, so that there was and yet they were all responding back to the central Ottoman control. And it was a very unique system, and in some ways, for a long time, it worked really well and was a model of a multicultural apparatus, if you will. And then things began to go terribly wrong as the empire began to crumble. And the taxes were increased, and Armenians began to realize that they had to actually defend themselves. So there was a whole movement through parties like the Tashnaksagan, the Armenican, Ramgavar. These are parties that were set up with the idea of defending the actual communities. The Ottomans were aware of that, and at one point, as the Young Turk government was brought in, and the Armenians were very involved in bringing in the Young Turk government, but as to when the plan began, it's a little unsure. I can't imagine that the Young Turks were as duplicitous as actually thinking about it from the very beginning, but they might have been. What happened after the beginning of the First World War is that some of these Fedai parties were trained in Russia, what was then Russia, so past the border. And the Turks began to feel that there was the possibility of an active fifth column. And they realized that that could attack them from their easternmost border with Russia. So they began to get this idea of moving away these communities from that border. And at one point, once that began, it got out of control. As to when that plan was institutionalized, I'm not quite sure anyone could tell us exactly. But what we do know, as Serj said, is that all of the communities and towns were basically drained away and put on these caravans through the desert to Syria. So they were either culminating in and beginning with this event on April 24th, where the leaders in Istanbul, then Constantinople, were rounded up and removed from their posts. Over half of them were killed on the spot, and then half of them were also part of this deportation.
There's also the aspect of it, you look at the leadership, they're like, oh, it's not our fault we're in this horrible situation with this war and economic degradation. It's their fault. It's the minority's fault. They're robbing you. They're the ones doing this. It happened, with the Nazis in World War II in that sense. And what they do is use the capital of the victims as a way of keeping their war going. It's an easy access to funds. And that happened again in the Armenian Genocide's case as well.
But I think that, and again, I don't know if there are any historians out there who might want to clarify, because again, I'm just giving a very brief sort of overview. But it seems to me that the Armenians were in a position of power within the Ottoman Empire. They were, and at a certain point, like what happened with the Jews in Eastern Europe, there was this idea that there was a betrayal, and that the Armenians were the cause of a lot of what was happening within the empire itself as it was crumbling. It was due to the sort of secret code and various sort of agreements that had been executed within the Armenian community, and that was now the evil that had to be rooted out. The main difference, of course, is that unlike the Jewish situation, where anti-Semitism spread rapidly from one country to the next, anti-Armenianism is something that is located very particularly in Turkey at that time. And so it didn't have the horrific sort of result of the Holocaust.
Thank you very much. It's been great listening. Given the status of the creative talent now in the United States among the Armenian community, it seems like we're at a good place. Why do you think there haven't been more films? Is there a fear of Turkish reprisal? Are there barriers? Because it seems like Armenians have money. They can fund projects. It seems like we have the talent. Is there a political barrier that there's a force out there not letting us put
There's
films
definitely
out?
a political barrier. I mean, when Miramax took on Ararat, Disney, which was their parent company, was absolutely flooded with emails. Like, it was insane. Like, basically the servers closed down, and the people at Disney just had never experienced anything like that in terms of that degree of virulent sort of reaction against the release of a film. Now, fortunately, it was being distributed by Harvey Weinstein, and he just was kind of salivating as he saw this, because it was just it was controversial, and it was something that he could actually use, and that was. But at some level, there's still all sorts of threats. But I also think it has to do with. I know the industry really well. It has to do with do people think it is a viable film project? Is it something that people are going to go to see? There's a film that a Chinese filmmaker that I think is a brilliant filmmaker, Yang Yimou, has just made a film about the Chinese massacres by the Japanese with Christian Bale, and it was being positioned for Academy attention, and no one went. I mean, literally, it's shocking. I mean, no one, even the Chinese community, went to see it, right? So it's not as though make film, and an audience will come, even with Christian Bale, right? Playing, interestingly enough, a missionary, sort of like trapped in, the middle of all of this, which seems to be sort of the typical Western sort of entry point, is to have someone who's like lost in the middle of this, carnage. It has to be very specific, because the industry won't respond unless it's a film that they think people will want to see. And I think it's a real mistake to make a film outside of the industry. I think it's a real mistake to kind of pour a lot of money from the community into something that you then present to the industry, because they're not they're not invested in it. Mm-hmm. So the only way to make a film is to actually say that this is something that we can attract actors to, we can actually attract foreign distribution on, to do it as a commercially viable project. Then it has a chance. Otherwise, it doesn't. My wife, it's interesting, after we made Ararat and kind of, we saw glimpses of this historic epic, she was in that film. The Taviani brothers, these very respected Italian directors, made this film called The Lark Farm, which is the film that everyone wanted Ararat to be. It's like this big historic epic with all these, great actors, and Arsene played the matriarch of this family, and we had all these European stars. We had Paz, what's her name? Paz Vega, this kind of like very attractive, Spanish actress playing, the heroine, and it never got released. I mean, I was shocked. I thought, that's crazy. I mean, there is the film, and at that point, it would have been interesting if a rich Armenian had actually sort of said, okay, I'll pay for it to be subtitled, and now that the film is there, I'll maybe even dub it, dub it into English from Italian, and but no one really stepped up to that, and that film just came and went. So it's not a question of just making the film. It has to break through, and I think that's a tall order. The Turks do not want to be overwhelmed by a lot of people on their borders, and so it's in their interest to actually make sure that if a new government is to be positioned in Syria, or if the situation needs to somehow find some resolution, because it can't sort of go on in this particular way, and they're all. Obviously, I'm not quite sure what the connection is between the Assad government and the current Turkish, state, but it's in Turkey's interest that situation be resolved. Obviously, because they can't accommodate this exodus back into the country.
I think they're also acting as surrogates to the West, arming the opposition without the West being technically involved, and there's also the Sunni angle, with Saudi Arabia and Turkey. It's the Sunni versus Alawite kind of thing. So, it's hypocritical, but yeah.
First, there's a East playing versus West issue, which is very important. The Turks were very good at this. Atatürk, that you mentioned, called his army the Red Army. He gave impressions to Lenin that he was going to join them, while he had made a deal with the English that if there was ever an attack again, that the English would come in. Lenin stopped a lot of the terrorist action that had started, saying, don't do anything, Turkey's coming in, you'll get your lands back. So they've been able to play this East versus West thing brilliantly from the beginning. On top of that, the historical element that you didn't mention is that Eastern Europe was being flooded out of its Muslims, just like the Syrian thing you just mentioned, but in a much more catastrophic scale. This has been known by historians. Istanbul had become twice its size in 1915 by influx of Muslims who didn't have anywhere to live. By getting rid of the Armenians in the provinces, they made room for that.
Oh, that's very
We
interesting.
were uninteresting, we were gyavurs, we were people who could be forgotten, while these Muslims had to be accommodated. So it's not so much that they were afraid of the Russians, it was that they had a real problem of their most important city being flooded by crime, which they could then
But then why didn't they actually then empty that city? Because that city, actually, the Armenian community within Istanbul was actually intact. I mean, it wasn't really affected, but with the exception of the intellectuals that were carted away, you know, and it's still an issue, I suppose, where you know, the lands in the east were completely denuded and kind of emptied. But that population didn't move out there. That was taken over by the Kurdish population.
There was an attempt to do this. It didn't work out.
Oh, I see.
The belief was that this would be the solution of their problem of the defeat that they had felt as a omnipotent power of being actually kicked out of Europe. You know, person gets beaten up by his boss at work, comes home and yells at the wife. Yeah. This is what happened.
Okay.
They come home and they just took it out on the Armenians. So the victimization is because they felt their empire was disappearing.
Okay. I wasn't really
and they're in denial because they still think they're a great nation. Nothing can ever go wrong.
Right.
Middle?
I'm really looking forward to
there's
some
one there.
denialists. Is there not really one denialist in this whole audience? Like, it seems like...
I wish I could be a denier, but I'm not. I know that Eric is going to thank you both, but as a listener, probably representing a lot of listeners, a multitude of thanks to the two of you for...
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
For engaging in conversation and thereby giving us a chance to meet you and, frankly, enlighten us this afternoon. I want to return to the question about the psyche of a people at a certain period of time and the marginalization that usually takes place long before a genocide. We know with the Jewish people, you have the Nuremberg trials in 35, and in 45 it's over. 10 years. Very planned. And I'd like you to address, it's partly rhetorical, I'd like you to address the issues of jealousy, envy, and the need that comes from being threatened and therefore blaming when a nation itself finds insecurity. It blames others for its troubles, whether it's the Armenians or the Jews or any prologue to that. And you mentioned assimilation for 600 years. And at what point is assimilation self-deception? We know that those of us who are Jewish, that we lived in self-deception. We wanted to be more German than the Germans were. So there is this paradox that I'd like you to comment on, sociologically and psychologically, of what happens to a people and the immense danger when we recognize marginalization and we do nothing about it, and then genocide does appear, and then we deny it.
It's a great question.
It's a really good point as far as marginalization. I think you have to make the other, whoever is going to be victimized, you have to make them into non-humans. It's occurred during Rwanda, Darfur, obviously Holocaust, genocide, and how else can you kind of radicalize people that normally would be, you know, reasonable thinking people into doing something completely insane and unreasonable? I think that's a really good point, that marginalization and kind of is the first step into going in there.
And I also think in the case of Turkey, you're dealing with a really complex psyche, a a culture which has never really quite placed itself between the Middle East and Europe. And so this idea of its own understanding of itself as a civilized Western power has been something that I think haunts it even to this day. Then within that you have a minority that's Christian, and which has these links to the West and through its church, and has in some ways presented itself as being a part of this culture. And Armenians, very much like I think Jews in Germany, felt that there was no way this could happen to them. They were so integrated into the politics and to the cultural life that they couldn't imagine this would have happened. And curiously enough, I would say that the Armenian community in Turkey, in Istanbul now, still sort of feels very integrated. They are very, very proud to be Turkish. And if you look at a figure like Hrant Dink, he was very fiercely proud of his citizenship as a Turk, and felt that that gave him a degree of privilege as an intellectual, which he clearly overestimated and was killed as a result. So let's also, the other thing I didn't say when I was talking about the historical perspective, it didn't start in 1915. I mean, there were massacres with Sultan Hamid in 1896, and when we talk about the Fedai movement, it was not just because of the increased taxation, it was because of these very real attacks on the people, pogroms, and there were all sorts of terrible events that happened before 1915. But I think in 1915, it escalates to genocide, where it's actually state-planned in such a meticulous way, and where you have this movement which is so orchestrated. And once that begins to work, it just works probably way better than anyone could have ever imagined. And it becomes very efficient. I also think that I've been doing some research lately, and one of the things is that it is technically, in some ways, the first genocide of the last century, but the Germans had done something very similar on the west coast of Africa before, and it's shocking when you look at the research about that there was this understanding, and there were concentration camps off the islands of someone will tell me it's Namibia. Namibia, yeah. So that there was an early prototype, and again, it's interesting in the book that I've read. That's used as a prototype, which comes back into the Holocaust. But there is this other event that happened between the two, and it's also interesting that there was, as I say, the Germans were allied to the Turks as well. So as to how. We'll never really know, unfortunately, because the archives have been completely, corrupted, and we do have access now to the German archives of the time, but it's one of those situations that I don't think there's a smoking gun that's going to appear at this point. It's been pretty carefully combed.
Thank you to the both of you. I want to ask a question to Mr. Egoyan. Can you elaborate a little bit on the Miramax Disney issue? Harvey Weinstein is one of those rabid people that when he wants to market a movie, he bullies people to go see it, as we saw with Bully. Was that type of an effort made with Ararat at the time?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, here's what happened with Ararat. He was really so excited about the film. I remember when we screened it for him, and the film was going to Cannes, and he bent over backwards to acquire it, and he hired this extraordinary person to kind of like prep him on how to speak about it, and he was there at the opening in Cannes, and I think what happened, and it was a surprise to a lot of people, is that the critics really dropped the ball. I mean, we were surprised at how many people who had been so supportive of what I was doing up to that point suddenly we're not there to defend the film, and actually we're talking about what the film should have been. It should have been a documentary. It shouldn't have been so confusing. It shouldn't have been this and that and that. Like, I mean, look at the films that had come before. I mean, it's coming from a tradition, but suddenly, I think because we were talking about this last night, because up until that point, with films like Calendar or Next of Kin and Family Viewing, Adjuster, the Armenianness was sort of abstracted a little bit. But suddenly it was front and center, and I think a lot of critics didn't know quite what to make of that. And he said, we had this meeting, he said, look, it's very difficult for me to release this film the way it should be released unless we get critical support. So we actually had this strange understanding. We said, if the film gets a positive review in the New York Times and the LA Times, then we have a chance. And I said, okay, let's wait and see. Well, the only positive reviews were, strangely enough, from the New York Times and the LA Times. The New York Times called it the most provocative film of the year, and it was a really great, and again, he was very excited, but that was about it. I mean, it was amazing how little other support there was. So we struck this deal where it was released in a limited way, and it was strangely enough, the same weekend in LA, which really mobilized and went to see it. But we struck this deal where he said he would activate his output deal with Disney. So that's why the film really got out, because it's still, I mean, I watched it, it was on a plane today when I came over. It was weird. I mean, and it was strange how few people were watching it in terms of their choice. But anyway, but strangely enough, a lot more people
were you checking them out?
Yeah, well, you can do that now. You can walk from the back of the plane forward, and everyone has individualized screens. And,
I haven't tried that
and
with
so
my music.
the people who were watching Ararat, I gave them a candy, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Got to get him in one way or the
other. But the thing is that it was really well distributed in its ancillary markets. So like it's still, you could go to any Blockbuster, you could pick up the DVD. He made a double DVD set, so there's a DVD of the film, then there's like historical sort of details, like a whole. It's a nice package. So I think he was as supportive as he could have been, given the lack of critical ammunition. I mean, I think he was prepared to kind of present it as an academy sort of positioning, but you can't do that unless you have backing.
There must have been so much pressure on you in terms of, I mean, personal pressure, that forget about the Turkish government and stuff, but every Armenian has their own, it's such, every Armenian has their own kind of vision of what a big film about the Armenian Genocide, how revealing it might be, how powerful of a statement it might make, having to do with geopolitical gain or understanding of our pain. And you were the first one to make that major film.
And it was such an unlikely filmmaker to do it, right? I mean, like, seriously, if Robert Lantos hadn't sort of done that at the Armenian Community Center, I don't know if my career would have taken that diversion. But given that it did, it was, it was pretty, as I said, it was kind of lonely, because I was dealing with a situation where I think a lot of people were expecting a certain type of film. And the fact is, it got distributed in 30 different countries. It was really, premiered at Cannes, it had all of this attention, but somehow it was never going to be enough unless it could actually make the point really clearly and hammer that home. And really, one of the funniest things that ever happened was about a few years ago, I got a call from a school teacher at an elementary school in Boston, and she was asking for permission. She said, I hope you don't mind, but if you take the scenes of the film within the film about the rebellion in Van, and if you put in intertitles, you have a very good historic document of the siege of Van. And I just want your permission to do that. Did you hire her as your editor? I kind of went, I can't tell you that that's okay, but I guess you're going to do it anyhow. And so I'm sure there's like a version that exists for school children, which is completely about the film within the film. And takes out all that other confusing stuff, and certainly the marijuana grow-op, which probably had no place in the film to start off with. But your song got in as a result. So,
hi, I'd like to ask a question about the idea, the concept of justice, and how this fits in to the Armenian Genocide story and so many other stories. To me, justice is almost a human need. There's a requirement we seem to have in ourselves for justice. And I wonder if you could speak to that from your perspectives as Armenians and as you view it in the broader sense, the world context and how we are.
To me, the Armenian Genocide issue was the awakening when I was younger to see other injustices around the world. It was like the opening for me to look around and go, okay, if this is a truth that's being denied for, political gain or some type of political capital, then what other truths are there that we're not hearing about, What other horrible atrocities, be they human rights or, I got into environmental rights because of it as well. And you start to see life as a balance-imbalance issue, and that's what justice did for me. In fact, I have an organization with my friend Tom Morello called Axis of Justice that we've had since 2002, and we take on a number of different causes and anything having to do with injustice, labor issues, human rights issues, and environmental issues.
I feel humbled because you're such a passionate advocate of this. I mean, you are front, center, and you fight those battles every day. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around the enormity of that question. And it's funny, I'm about to embark on this film on the West Memphis 3, which is also a question of a terrible mistrial of justice, right? These 17-year-olds in West Memphis that were put in prison for something that they didn't do. And how is that possible? And I do think that once the train has left the station we were talking about, once people decide to prosecute, then their job is to get a conviction, whether it's just or not, right? And which is why I'm so passionately against the death penalty, because it's just, what if, at some point, it's a human life we're talking about, and this is a genocide we're talking about. So I don't even know how you begin to broach, justice on that scale. I mean, it just seems to me so monumental.
I mean, the value of
I just
1.5 million lives. The property, the relocation, the pogroms,
I mean, I think that's one of the most moving things about Peter Balakian's book, Black Dog of Fate, is that those pages where you sort of read, his grandmother's insurance claim, and there's a list of all the people she lost, and right. And you just go, that's insane. Yeah. That this person, that's the only recourse that she had at the time, right, was to extract, an insurance claim, and which she never got, right? And I agree. It is within us. We need that, but how do we satisfy that? And I can't imagine. And it's odd that if it is ingrained, why don't we have the mechanism to prevent it? Right. Why is it that we can allow that to happen at that scale? And it is odd that maybe when it is at that scale, it becomes even more abstract.
Isn't justice something that's been denied to the Armenian people? So the Armenian people have never really been justified because of the position, at least of the government of Turkey. So the Armenian people are kind of left in this limbo of non-justice.
Right. It's there's a certain aspect of victimization that plays in there, and loss of hope when year after year your government does not do the right thing. In the U.S., as far as the genocide resolution in Congress or the president's statements on April 24, the day of commemoration of the Armenian Genocide. However, I think, again, I think you have to go toward something more constructive. You have to, in the end, I can't depend on President Obama or future President anyone or even the government of Turkey to do the right thing. I can't depend on myself to do the right thing, and I can depend on you to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that ultimately, again, if you have to seek within yourself an internal system which is able to rectify. Because if you're looking at coming from outside, it's just not going to happen, and you can't exist as a victim. It's not healthy. So it's very, very precarious. But I mean, and I find myself at a point when I listen to you sometimes, I go, wow, I wish and maybe it's your upbringing as well. I mean, this idea of justice, and I look at it certainly with my wife, Arseniye Khanjan, who has also had a similar upbringing to you, like very politicized, and her seeking of justice, and it's very real for her what that means. And for me, I just don't want to be in that place. It's a place of anger and frustration, and it's enraged all the time, right? And it's not healthy. And yet, if you don't have that, I don't know where you get the political will to keep the cause going, and how you make this art, or how you that's what I really love about that song, because when I listen to it, I'm in that place immediately, and it's important to know when to deploy that, because it's necessary as well to feel that indignation when the time is right.
Definitely.
I'm not actually sure how to frame this question, to be honest. Just listening to a lot of what you're talking about, Atom, you mentioned earlier, like talking about Arshil Gorky and how his work has persevered and how it's a testament to our culture. And listening to this, what concerns me is that now our culture is being presented solely as a culture of genocide and not a culture of Armenians. You know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense. And that's something that deeply concerns me. And I'm just wondering how, we're talking about, it's Genocide Commemoration Week, and, we're on the heels of April 24th, but how do we protect that as opposed to the culture of genocide?
It's quite interesting you asked that question. Well, Carla Garabedian can attest to this, but while we were making Screamers, Darren Malakian from System of a Down, when it was time to do his interviews, like he had, we were all doing interviews and talking about our family and this and that. And when it was his time, he came up and talked to me before the interview. He goes, I've got a little issue. And I'm like, what's the issue? And he said, I don't like the whole victimization aspect of it after all these years. He goes, our culture is way more rich than that. Our alphabet, our first Christian nation, as far as a national religion, and our music and our art and our, and I'm like, dude, talk about that. Like, talk about whatever you want to talk about. I think that's a really valid point.
The context of this particular talk is about genocide, and it could have been just as richly a talk about the alphabet or Christian influences on architecture, and there's this amazing things that the culture has contributed, which don't have to do with genocide, but that's, I guess, why we're here today, is talking about that. It would have been kind of weird not to talk about it at all. I guess that would have been kind of interesting,
artists,
right?
So
we
were qualified.
Yeah, we were thinking about just coming out and playing music, then thought that would be a little irresponsible, but.
You mentioned 40 Days of Muzadar earlier, being a book. I'm aware that I believe MGM, sometime in the 30s, was actually producing it into a film, and the Turkish government did what they did to stop it. Now, you were saying that in order for a film to be economically viable, for a production company to want to produce it, they need to see, actors want to act in it, people want to go see it. So what better a selling point than, this is a movie that was, stopped in production because it was so controversial 60, 70 years ago, however long it was.
Would you go and see that movie? I mean, I don't know. If I heard a movie was like banned 60 years ago, I would not be rushing, Friday night to buy that ticket. I mean, I'm sorry. It's not in itself going to be enough to make people go and see it. It's just, a hard, brutal reality is that we are so inured to controversy now that the controversy of 60 years ago seems kind of quaint, to be honest. It's not enough. But if you take the kernel of that story and you make something that's amazing and just, proclaimed as a great piece of cinema, then people will go. And you can use the controversy at that point. I mean, obviously that's part of the story of it, but it's not in and of itself enough of a reason, I don't think. That's my own feeling.
I would like to argue that and say that usually when someone hears something is banned or it's, controversial, there's just a generated interest in, what is it about?
I'll tell you what is actually really exciting to me is, because it's such a rich novel, it's amazing. Like what Werfel did is incredible. Like I don't know how they don't write books like that anymore in terms of the amount of research and character detail, is TV series, right? I mean, as a historical sort of like series, then that makes more sense because I think people are gravitating to seeing history on television right now. You look at, the success of like from the Borgias to even the Mad Men, Game of Thrones, and the Rome. Like these are very successful series. So that might be a more viable way of presenting, and not reducing the novel, right? Because the novel is a hefty piece of work, which is compelling and brilliantly written.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. I think you just gave a whole bunch of writers an idea.
Okay. Nice.
I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to thank Serj and Adam for their wonderful discussion. This was far better than I could imagine. They've been hanging out together for 24 hours. I didn't think they had anything to talk about.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, and please continue to support the Hammer Museum. Thank you.